Nyawiskano, Rebecca Bowen Nigaso. On May 23rd, 1964, the Seneca Nation of Indians Constitution was amended by referendum vote by the men, providing women with the right to vote. This happened a millennia after the establishment of the Great Law of Peace, 116 years after the establishment of the Seneca Nation of Indians' new government, 44 years after women in the United States were provided the right to vote. So today I'd like to present Seneca Women, Always a Voice, One Seneca Woman's Perspective. And I'm going to begin with the words of Luther Standing Bear. He said, "For it is the mothers, not her warriors, who create a people and guide our destiny." So there's no better place to begin but at the beginning, and that's with creation. With our origins, and all people have an origin, we see a reflection of our place in the universe. We learn about our relationship with the spiritual world. We learn about our relationship with the natural world. And we see the origination of our group ethics. It was an interesting experience I had in 1994. I participated in a search conference sponsored by the Seneca Nation. And searching is a planning methodology. If you have a goal in mind, you spend several days as a group and you're working toward that goal. How are you going to accomplish that goal? And you begin the process with looking at your history. And they were all Seneca participants, and the facilitators were non-native, and they were from a very prestigious university. And they said, well, we're going to do the task of creating a historical timeline, and we're going to begin with 1776. And everybody in the room was just kind of, and finally one gentleman spoke up, and he said, we go far beyond 1776, and we begin at the beginning. And so I think the facilitators were taken a little aback, but that's what we did. We began at the beginning. And you see that across the board with all indigenous accounts of creation. You see the role that women play in these creation accounts. For the Cherokee, they have the Corn Mother, who the life-sustaining corn sprang from her blood. You have among the Tewa people, you have the Blue Corn Woman, you have White Corn Maiden, and they are the summer and winter mothers. But you have the White Painted Woman, and she gives birth to a hero warrior who makes the world a safe place to live. White Buffalo Calf Woman among the Lakota, she brought the sacred pipe, the basis for truth. The Spider Woman and White Shell Woman among the Dene, Spider Woman brought the light of the sun, and White Shell Woman created the people from corn. So, and among our people, the Haudenosaunee, Sky Woman, she fell from the sky world. She was pregnant, and as she fell through that hole in the sky world, she grasped some of that sacred soil in her hand. And as she fell, her fall was broken by birds, and they gently conveyed her down to the turtle's back. And with that sacred soil, we see the creation of Turtle Island, where we are today. And she gave birth to a woman, to a girl, and who in turn, brought more of how we look at our ethics today. She gave birth to to twin sons. So we play a vital role in these creation accounts. So from the very beginning. Now we're going to take a leap in time here and jump into the establishment of Onöhsagwë, the great binding law of peace. And what we see happening here is that women go from carriers of life to being mandated with authority under the great law. And I always thought it was interesting that the peacemaker who brought that message of peace came from a home that was headed by his mother and his grandmother. When the peacemaker brought his message to our territory, it is said the first person to accept that message of peace was a woman. Because of that, the peacemaker gave her a new name, Chigon, meaning new face. And it's also played out in the Great Law. Article 44 says that the lineal descent of the people of the five nations shall run in the female line. Women shall be considered the progenitors of the nation. They shall own the land and the soil. Men and women shall follow the status of the mother. The Great Law goes on to afford women the authority, the power to select, to nominate, to appoint, to depose chiefs. And that's because the women own that title. doesn't belong to the men. The women hold it. So we see the women also have the authority and the ability to hold counsel, and they have the power of redress. I think it's also important to look at worldview. And I take this definition of worldview from Carol Cornelius in her Iroquois Corn in a culture based curriculum. And she defines worldview as that which contains the knowledge which a culture defines itself. It contains the beliefs that form the central core of the culture's understanding of the world. And those two things shape the cultural enactments of those beliefs. So, with that definition in mind, I want to take a look at two different worldviews. We'll look at the Western worldview, what came over from Europe. And in three words, I think we're looking at ethnocentrism, which is an attitude of comparison. And actually, all humans are susceptible to that. When you meet somebody, for the first time, what is your impression? There's an impression that's made, and that can begin to swirl into ethnocentrism. The Western worldview was Eurocentric, where they measured everything according to European values. And of course, it was androcentric. It was male-centered. Those three things made a mix that resulted in an attitude of domination. We can see that in the Papal Bull of 1493. So I found this quote and I thought it was really interesting. And for me, it really pulled in those three aspects of the Western worldview. And this was Sepulveda. He was a theologian from the 1500s, and he was Spanish. And in his writings, he said, he was talking about, the people they had encountered over here on Turtle Island. And he said, if you know the customs and nature of the two people with perfect right, okay, now he's looking at ethnocentrism here. With perfect right, the Spaniards rule over these barbarians of the New World and the adjacent lands. It's Eurocentric, who in wisdom, virtue, intelligence, and humanitas are as inferior to the Spaniards as children to parents, women to men. Okay, there's your androcentrism. As cruel people are from mild people. And I always thought this was a little ironic that when he wrote this, Spain was in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition. Here's a view of the Haudenosaunee worldview. And it's one that's focused on balance and harmony, and we see that through the Great Law of Peace. And its goal is to maintain community stability, mutual satisfaction. And we see the aspect of it being egalitarian. It's complementary, and the roles are equal. There's an equal distribution of labor. In the old society, the men had certain tasks, clearing the fields, building the longhouses, and being the warriors who defended and protected the people. And the women took care of the people through their gardens, massive gardens. They were in charge of distributing that food and making sure everyone was taken care of. And both the men and the women had ceremonial and spiritual responsibilities. It's communitarian, that everything is done for the community as a whole. And one of the popular phrases of current days is, it takes a village. Well, we were doing that a long, long time ago, and all working together for the benefit of the entire community. And in order to do that, it has to be consensus driven. There has to be a general agreement. There has to be some solidarity and even some unanimity. We were had a worldview that was matrilineal. We've seen, what the Great Law had to say. So this enabled women to enjoy power and authority. Even in coming together of a man and woman, it was matrilocal, where the husband took up residence with the wife and her family in their longhouse. I want to share some quotes that I've come across, and this first quote comes from the Cherokee. And if you're familiar with how things went back in the day, that it wasn't just the men who went to these meetings and so forth. It was a contingent of the people that included women, included children. And so they would go to these meetings. And in this case, the Cherokee were meeting with the British. And one of the Cherokee leaders asked, "Where are your women? After all, white men as well as red are born of women." Same thing happened 1762. Seneca women sent one of their chiefs for a meeting with the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, William Johnson, and um, Johnson asked that the women not attend. And he was told by a Seneca chief, he said, it was always the custom for our women to be present at such occasions, being of much estimation amongst us, in that we proceed from them, and they provide our warriors with provisions when they go abroad. 1788, a Seneca-Cayuga orator said, our ancestors considered it a great offense to reject the counsels of their women, particularly that of female governesses, who were the clan mothers. In 1846, Young Chief, a Seneca chief from the Cattaraugus territory, he said, it is my opinion that God has made women better than men, and I know they are wiser. So we'll take a quick look at contrasting worldviews in regards to women, and looking at a time frame of the mid 1800s. And we see that the Haudenosaunee, socially, children followed the lineage of the mother, and we see that that stems from the Great Law and women being carriers of life. In Euro-American Western worldview, socially, children are the property of the father. Among the Haudenosaunee, economically, women control their own personal property. They work communally. The land belongs to them. In the Euro-American Western worldview, economically, women have no rights to their own property, to their body, to their children, and they, in many ways, live isolated lives. Among the Haudenosaunee, spiritually speaking, women are interrelated with creation, with Mother Earth, and women have their own ceremonial responsibilities. In the Euro-American Western society, spiritually, women are viewed as subordinate to men's authority. You know, women are even forbidden to have a voice in the church. The Haudenosaunee, politically speaking, it's the women we've seen in the Great Law who select the chiefs. You know, and they serve as the clan mothers. You know, they have a women's council, and it's all mandated by the Great Law. In the Euro-American Western worldview, politically, it's illegal for women to vote. They have no decision-making power. You know, and that's mandated at this point in time by the U.S. Constitution. What were the impacts of the meeting of these two worldviews when you look at the history and the creation of the United States of America? But even before then, we see the first Europeans to arrive here. They're what they call explorers. They're trappers. You know, they're traders, and they're the ones who are writing down in their journals about the people they are encountering. And you find a great absence of any reference to the women. And that was because these men came from an androcentric worldview. And so to them, the women were invisible. They were only concerned with what the men were doing. We see ethnocentrism in anthropology. You know, in the late 1800s and the 1880s, anthropology as a science was being developed. And we see the creation of social Darwinism. And that's a ranking, if you will, of races. And it puts them all on a spectrum, and they're either civilized all the way to savagery. And you know, there's natural selection and all these other sort of concepts, and that's based on that androcentrism. And these men are coming from a Western worldview, so they're applying what their principles are to other peoples. We see missionaries and the impact that had on indigenous communities. You know, that it caused separation, and it actually too, for some people, for some indigenous people, it brought spiritual satisfaction. So, but as a result of that, there was a separation that came about. And even in the Code of Hansen Lake, the foundation of which is Onöhsagwë, the Great Law, that code was built upon that foundation. And we looked to see that it's more individually oriented. You know, he's encouraging people to be a nuclear family. And, you know, he touches on marriage, and he touches on domestic abuse and child abuse and elder abuse. You know, he touches on the effects of alcohol and in, you know, people's lives. And that brings about a change also. There's an impact there. You know, look at treaty making and government policies. Treaty making, you know, we've already seen a couple of statements where the Europeans, the early Americans were not interested in having women present, but yet that was part of our old traditional policies to the Great Law. You see government policies, federal laws that were created, and I always think of the 1887 General Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act or the Severalty Act. And what happened there was, indigenous nations across Turtle Island were they were scammed. I believe it was a scam. They were scammed out of their lands. You know, about 90 million acres of land were lost because of that federal act. And in that act, they did not recognize women as heads of household. They only looked at the men. So we see these government policies that, neglected to have respect for women. Boarding schools. I think we're all familiar with the impacts of boarding schools. We see it brought about a disintegration of the family structure. You had children being taken from their homes, and from their families, from their communities, taken far away, and sometimes for years on end. They would be gone for 7, 8 years or so. Some were very young when they left. So they didn't have that opportunity to see how a family should function, how a community should function. What are the traditions? They can't participate in those. They're punished for speaking their language. Alcohol. I mentioned that was a concern of Handsome Lake, and alcohol set a breach. It sets a breach in people's lives, individual lives. It separates families. It causes chaos. For a community, and be it alcohol was the drug of the day. And today we still deal with that impact. And then 1848, there's political change at home for us, for Seneca people. I'd like to take a closer look at an impact, and by taking a little closer look at the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, and looking at their influence here amongst the Senecas. The Quakers initially arrived here because they felt they were being persecuted in Europe, and so the sect came over here, and they settled. And as early as 1750, they were in Oneida territory, and by 1798, they arrived here in Seneca territory at Allegheny, and their premise, what they wanted to do was to create a model farm and to create a school. And their intent was not to proselytize. And so the first thing they did was, go to Corn Planter, and they did set up a school. And that school did exist for several years, for about 5 years. And but things fell apart, mainly because suspicion. There was just, with all the loss of land, everything that was going on, the chaos that these impacts were having on Seneca society, there was a lot of suspicion. So the Quakers thought best to withdraw, and they relocated just off territory here at Allegheny. And so they shortly thereafter, around 1805, they started a school, and they decided they wanted to focus on the females. So this particular one-room school was made for females. They would bring in Seneca girls and women, and they focused on soap making, spinning, knitting, the homemaking skills and so forth. And in time, there were a lot of girls who wanted to attend, and so they added another schoolroom, and so they operated that for a number of years. And about 1852, they decided to open it up as a boarding school. And so children could go there. One reason was because some children would walk to school on Monday and be there just stay there all week. They would sleep in a schoolhouse, and before they went back home for the weekend. And so the Quakers ended up hiring a Seneca woman who would go there at the schoolhouse and stay and help to take care of the children. And so they felt that for the well-being of the children, they would have this boarding school, and they granted they would also have more of their own influence over the children, and it was at that point opened up to boys. And the school itself has a very interesting history, and so it was closed in 1938. But other things were happening with the Quakers at that time. They met pretty regularly with the chiefs, and to discuss what they wanted to do or what they wanted to carry out. A lot of it was education focus, or they would bring farm equipment, and they weren't super wealthy people, in that, but they would bring, some, modern equipment of the day, and share it, and leave it with the Senecas, and use it. They might bring a cow or two, and give it to, a family, or, and they would do things like that, to encourage farming, on an individual farm basis. And so that was their effort. So in these yearly meetings, they would, discuss various issues. But there was something else going on in the larger world, in the United States, and that was the rise of the women's right movement in the mid 1800s. And it's very interesting to note that the leaders that you see um, in this movement are Quaker women. And the Seneca Falls Women's Right Convention in 1848 was pretty much organized by Quakers, Quaker men and women. And so we see Lucretia Mott, you know, um, and she actually, the convention was held in July 1848, and she and her husband visit the Cattaraugus territory in June of 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a very young woman in 1848, and she was just, and she spoke. That was the first time she had ever spoken in public, and because women weren't allowed to speak in public, and so that was a monumental movement for her. And so these women were familiar with the Haudenosaunee people. They lived near Haudenosaunee communities, and so we also see Susan B. Anthony. She, we've all heard her name, and she was also a Quaker, and she visited Salamanca, as did Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which sits on Allegheny territory. So the basic premise or belief for the Quakers is that in God's eyes, men and women are created equal, and so they operate from that perspective. At the same time period, we see them. They're also involved in the temperance movement. They're involved in the abolition of slavery. So in many ways, they're giving birth to a lot of these movements. The mid 1800s becomes a crazy mix of thinking and actions and so forth. And we see New York State involved. We see the feds involved. Also, the Quakers have been here for 50 years at this point in time. And so uh, what has happened as a result of the Buffalo Creek treaties of 1838 and 1842, and even before then, the dwindling, the vast loss of land that we have suffered, um, just in one lifetime, is affecting the people. We see all these impacts, the impacts of alcohol and all of those sorts of things. We're seeing it. So there's a high level of discontent here amongst the Seneca people, and they um, many of them blame the chiefs, and for particular reasons, for the loss of land. That you know they feel that the annuities that come from the government are being kept by the chiefs, or they're not distributing them equally. And so there's just there's a need here. There's poverty, and so women want to be able to take care of their families, their children. So at a council that was held at Cattaraugus in 1845, the state was there, and they would in time, New York State would in time, endorse the passage of what the chiefs had decided to do, and that was to, um, they would henceforth, with the voice also of the warriors, of the men, they would make those decisions about the, selling of land. So basically, it wasn't just up to the chiefs. They were going to vote on it, essentially. So that was a change that was made. And so New York State, played out from that, and they created, other posts. They created marshals, they created peacemaker, and I believe they created a treasurer. And so they created these posts, to sit on the Chiefs Council. And so those changes were coming about. And so at this particular council, the Quakers were there, and you know, because they were supportive of this particular change in the government. They felt that it was important to have educated Senecas, because they had to deal with the avarice, the land stealing that was taking place through New York State and through the feds, and they wanted the Seneca people to be prepared for that. And so they advocated in behalf of New York State to support this uh, amongst the Senecas. So, but for the Quakers, they had another purpose, and I take the words right from the conference reports, and uh, and the purpose for the Quakers was to induce them, the Senecas, to make a radical change in their system of domestic economy, especially as regards the division of labor among them, the withdrawal of their females from the labors of the field and other employments not suited to the delicacy of their sex, and that hereafter they should devote themselves to the business of their household affairs. So they proposed to instruct your young women in all the branches of female employment, which will be necessary to enable them to become good housekeepers and suitable companions of intelligent, industrious husbands, and qualify them to train up their children in habits and principles which will render them respectable, good citizens. So yes, we see the meddling in the way things are, and but the branches of female employment that they're looking at are again sewing, knitting, spinning, washing, ironing, cooking, and other appropriate business. And this particular effort is going to take place on the Cattaraugus territory. And so the following year, there's another council at Cattaraugus, and you know present at that meeting are, there's a lot of feds at this meeting because at this point in time, they want to reassure the Senecas that, they do not have to, and this is their word, emigrate, west. And, we call it removal, but they called it emigration at this point in time. They said you're no longer required to go, but if you want to go, you can go. And so some do, and we see the chiefs are there, excuse me, and um, they give reports of how many of their people have gone. And just as a piece of information, you didn't have any people from any Senecas from Allegheny emigrating. 47 went from Cattaraugus, 58 went from Buffalo. There were none from Tonawanda, 41 from Cayuga, and there were 8 from Onondaga. And these numbers also included chiefs. And so that was the primary discussion of the 2 days. But what they did was to create a committee comprised of about 25 people. It included Seneca chiefs, Quaker men, and Seneca and Quaker women. And the women are in this particular committee are making up approximately half of the committee. And so what they do basically is they decide to close the school for the girls and they want to open it up. So they propose to enlarge the school building to enable all children, not just females, to attend. To get a response from a Seneca woman whose name appears, through these years in various issues and documents and so forth. And she spoke, and she said, "I am instructed by the women now present today that we fully approve the propositions that have been made in reference to the education of our children, and that it is our earnest desire that they may be instructed in the manner recommended. We will do all in our power to cooperate in and promote so good a work." So we see basically what becomes the foundation for the Thomas Indian School, the asylum beginning. I have a couple more quotes here from that council of 1846 that took place at Cattaraugus, and in regards to the Seneca woman who we've already heard from. And she continues saying, "I am one of the females appointed to come here and listen to what our friends might have to say. This is the first time any opportunity has been offered for one of my sex to be heard in any of the deliberations of our nation. We feel thankful for this favor and congratulate ourselves that we have been permitted to meet our female friends here in council, and trust a new and better prospect is about opening before us." And there's also a male Quaker committee member who speaks up, and he says, "I trust the time is not distant when you will be able to understand and appreciate the importance of availing yourselves of the women's cooperation in the management of all your domestic and social affairs, and when the Seneca women will no longer be considered in any way inferior to our sex, but will be placed on the same ground as Indian men." So what may appear to be a conflict here, between the mandates of the Great Law and our experience as a people, I don't really see as a conflict. Traditionally, it was the men who would sit out and for the meetings, for negotiations, or all that sort of thing. But it was at the end of the day that information was taken back to the women. You see it again in these negotiations that took place through the years that, they didn't give an answer of whatever the issue was on the table, so because they took it back to the women and the women made their decisions and informed the men. And you even see that in some of, as fraudulent as some of these treaties were, the 1797 Big Tree Treaty, you see the land speculators um, going to the women um, to offer gifts of cows and so forth to get them chiefs to support and sign the treaty. So it's not necessarily a conflict, and to me, this is just the first time maybe physically they sat at the same table. So we also see, back to Lucretia Mott and her experience, and um, she visits Cattaraugus, and she reports that she has had the opportunity to see Seneca women participating in political discussions, and she sees and witnesses the authority of the women in the preparations for the strawberry ceremonies. The new Seneca Nation government of 1848, and I have more quotes here that I'd like to share with you. I just think it's so important to read the words rather to really hear my interpretation of everything. And we're getting very close here to that change in government that takes place on December 4th, 1848. And I mentioned one of the issues that was really bothering a lot of the women was that of annuities. And so we hear from the women in what they call memorials. And this one in October 1848 is a memorial signed by Seneca women on behalf of the Seneca women, and they want this particular Quaker person, who was Philip Thomas, to carry their wishes to the Secretary of War. And so it says, the women of the Cattaraugus Reservation wish to address you a few words in this time of our trouble. And we do so the more cheerfully because we know the Friends are always laboring to promote the welfare of the females among the Indians and to improve their condition. We have taken the same view of the subject of annuities which was taken by the old men long since dead who first entered into these arrangements. They declared that every individual, man, woman, and child, had an equal right to our moneys and to our lands, in short, to all our national property, that it was so from the beginning, and that it always should be so. So we see some signatures or some signings on there of Seneca women from Cattaraugus. So that takes place before that change of government, several months later. So that very next spring, in April of 1849, we hear from the women again. And what has happened that even though there's a change in government, the Indian agent, that works with the Haudenosaunee people, the federal Indian agent, has taken it upon himself to, give the annuities to the men. And so this is the next memorial that's written. And it says, lest it should be thought that Indian women have tongues that never tire, we only add that it is the earnest prayer of the undersigned in their own behalf and in the behalf of a large majority of the mothers, wives, and daughters of the Seneca Nation, that the recognition of the new government may be permitted to stand and that we may be paid our annuities. So, and it's signed, particularly with this one Seneca woman again, and 19 other females. And so there wasn't an acknowledgement of, oh, there's a new government and the men have suffrage, but the women don't. It's, they're looking at the issues of annuities and so forth. And, because basically, the women haven't really lost, that traditional standing. They still own the land. They still have those rights, and they can be heard in the council sessions. They can be heard in the courts of the Seneca Nation, and so they still have this authority. And so, jumping ahead quite a bit to 1887. What's happened once the new government was established, and in those early 20, 25 years, there was a lot of back and forth. They got the new government, and then they had an election every year. in at the beginning for the first 50 years or so. And so, and then the next year they'd have an election and the chiefs would get back in. And then the next year the new government would get back in. So it went back and forth. And so in time, it just kind of quelled a little bit more and more. But what would happen when they were going to amend the Constitution, one of the Indian men would send a letter to the Quakers, seeking their input, their advice on whatever the amendments were. And so we have a letter that, a letter was written by Henry Talchi from Cattaraugus, and he sent it to Joseph Elkington, who had a lot of experience he was Quaker and living experience here at Allegheny, at Tunasasa at the Quaker school. And so he responds, Elkington responds, and he says, I do not see that your women are to vote. I think heretofore, in case of a treaty making, the mothers have voted. It might be well to give the matter thought as to what you want on other occasions. But I would not favor depriving the mothers from voting in case of any treaty as heretofore. So how I read that is he's not saying it, but he's saying, you want the women to vote, in the Seneca Nation. Yes, I know that they can vote on treaties and such, but, what about other times? So I think that's part of that, the Quaker principle of everyone being created equal in the eyes of God. In the United States in 1920, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was passed in the United States. It was ratified. And so what we see here is really the first document that I've ever seen that pertains to that. And it's from November of 1920, and it's from the New York Indian Welfare Society. And it notes that, they're members of the Seneca Nation, but, taking a look through some of our records here, not all of these names appear on our tribal enrollment in 1920. But it says here, what they're basically looking for is women's franchise, the right to vote, and they're also looking for a new form of government. So I'm not really sure if, it was hard to find more information about this particular, society. And so I don't know if it's a carryover from, returning to the government by the chiefs, which has always been and is an undercurrent. And or did they have something else in mind? I'm not really sure. But this is really the first mention. And beyond that, we find in the council minutes in 1931 and in 1935, there were motions brought forward. There's no record of a discussion or anything, but both motions to, look into getting women the vote are defeated by council. So the pursuit of the vote for women enters into a new phase. It comes onto the council floor, and motions are being made and being defeated. And we see the first actual referendum in 1951. And what surprised me more was the Allegheny vote count. There were only 10 voters, men, and they did all vote yes for women's suffrage. And but I wondered why. But this old news article, it explains that there was apparently a totally different issue, and there was an attempt to boycott this referendum, and that had to do with the amendment procedure. There were some who favored, following like the New York State procedure, and then there was the Seneca Nation process for amending the Constitution. So that was a conflict leading to the boycott. And then 1956, it took a while. By the Constitution, you can't, you have to give a space of at least a year before you can bring that back up. So the issue comes back to the table in 1956, and it's really you see the birth of the movement, and we actually for the first time see the name Seneca Women's Organization, and we see names such as Martha Green Flamel, who is really just a real leader in this movement. We see Edith Luke, Rita Williams, Ravina Abrams. These names are started to make the print. We see Selene Kennedy, Bernice Pierce, and they are out there. They're working, and the president at this time is Leo Cooper, and so he takes the initiative. They sent out postcards to the women, to survey their interests in having the vote. how, and but he reports to council that, I don't know the tone of his voice, but in the words he says, less than half of the women bothered to respond. And he also says that he's been approached by a number of men asking him to kill the proposal. And we read those sorts of words in the council minutes. But to hear from one of the male members from the audience, and I thought was very interesting. This is years and years after the treaty era and the loss of all our lands. But a man in the audience says that he doesn't believe the women should have the vote, and because it was the women who selected the chiefs who sold our land and our homes. And so I thought that was very interesting. After all these many years, that thinking is there. It's foundational. And so also one of the counselors, he speaks up and he says he doesn't feel that women are capable of handling both civil, or service, public service, and the duties of the home. So, but he's magnanimous in that. I think he made the motion to take it to a constitutional committee for consideration. So ultimately, this 1956 referendum was also defeated. Just a little sidebar here regarding ignorance and racism in the media. And unfortunately, there's always seems to be ignorance and racism and in the world. But just looking at these three articles as examples, and in 1957, these articles appeared. And what that first article, Governor signs bill giving vote to Indian women, and that was just part of that uh, attempt to infuse New York State jurisdiction. So New York State passed a law saying, that Indian women could vote in tribal elections. And so I know here at the Seneca Nation, they took offense to that. They said, you don't tell us what to do. We'll make that decision. So that didn't hold water here. But as you get into this article, it's you know you can see the ignorance and the racism when it talks about Indian chiefs and braves, and how for generations they've been at peace, but now they're on a warpath with Indian women and maidens. And so we see that in that article. In the article in the center, the headline is, just I can't even say it, but the article itself is factual. It doesn't carry, it doesn't reflect what the headline is. And then the third article, again, that it was the headline and the article were pretty bad in the language and their thinking and so forth. And just the first paragraph says, word reached this white man's legislative stockade today that big new trouble is brewing among the Redskins. Woman trouble. Just, a little sidebar, food for thought. In the midst of this effort for the women to get the vote, we encountered Kazua, and that took up a good decade. It's not that it just started in 1956. It had been talked about as far back as 1908, and so it eventually came to our home front. And this particular photo is of my home being burned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But this was a very traumatic time, another traumatic time in our history. And what we see here is, what was happening was in 1956, the Army Corps of Engineers asked the Seneca Nation for permission to do a survey here at Allegheny. And in October of, I think it's like October 20th of 1956, the council voted unanimously. And I think it's very interesting in the minute books. It says that everybody agreed, it was unanimous, that they be denied permission to do that survey. And this was really taking the foremost thought and consideration of the Senecas here, particularly at Allegheny. And so it was 10 days after that session that a referendum for women to get the vote was held, and it was defeated. But we see what comes from there is an energy for the women to really pursue getting a vote, and to vow to have a campaign, and to just take care of business and get it done. And so we also see, right after that, the following month was an election, and we have an administration coming in which is a little more supportive of the women getting the right to vote. And what happened during Kinzua, and as we got deeper into it, the council established various committees. They had one overall umbrella committee that included pretty much all the councilors, and that was called the Kinzua Planning Committee. They had a series of subcommittees, but we see some women, several women coming forward, and their names are present, and they're very active. And we see Maribel Printup. She is the chair of the Education Committee. We see Dima Stouffer. She's the chair of the Housing and Relocation Committee. We see Rovina Abrams being very active as the secretary of the Consumer Planning Committee, and she's also the deputy clerk for the nation. And so we see some of these women coming forward, and being heard in the council in regards to Kinzua. So much later in 1956, at the December 4th council session, which interestingly was 108 years to the day after the establishment of the new government, the women came into council, and it wasn't to pursue the vote. It was to present a petition. And actually, two petitions were presented that day. One was for what they call the legal voters, or the men, and the other one was what's called the Mothers of the Nation petition. And the preamble for this petition says, "We, the undersigned mothers of the Seneca Nation of Indians, pursuant to Section 5 of our national Constitution, in which the treaty-making powers vested in the Council of said Seneca Nation of Indians are subject to the approval of at least three-fourths of the legal voters and the consent of three-fourths of the mothers of the nation, do hereby respectfully petition the Council to officially oppose the acquisition of any lands of said Seneca Nation." And it was signed by 122 mothers from Allegheny. And it's very interesting to look at. You can see they actually began in the Onöhsagwë community and worked their way all the way up. And they go community by community to get these signatures. And it was very generously given to us by a businessman from Warren, Pennsylvania. His name is Todd Betts, and he's also a collector of documents. And he purchased this petition on eBay. So we're very appreciative that he gave it to the nation in 2011. So the next referendum vote was held in May of 1959, and again it was defeated by 30 votes. And then again, one was held in 1962, and it was once again defeated, 118 no and 106 yes. In March of 1964, at the council session, we see a real emergence of the effort to get the vote. We see Martha Flamong introducing a petition that contains 162 signatures of women seeking the right to vote. And the council session is held at the Old Thomas Indian School. And according to one article, there were 75 people thereabouts, and half of them were women. And so I think that it was just a accumulation of all that effort coming forward in the coming months. And we also had an administration which was favorable to women getting a vote. The president at that time was George Herron, and I believe he spoke up on behalf of women as early as his very first council session in 1946, thereabouts. And so we see him, seeking women's support and standing up for it. And so we see here two of the really vital leaders in the movement. We see Martha Flamong in the center, and we see Hildreth Kanjokity from Allegheny, who headed up the effort here in leading that. And Martha made a very interesting quote, and it just talks about that desire to get out there and get it done. And she says, in regards to an all-out campaign, she says that she's determined to wage an all-out campaign. She says, I have learned to be persistent. I have had to wait a good long time for many of the things I have wanted, and I want this very much for the good of our nation. I have been turned down before, but turning me down is like picking me up. Finally, at a referendum held on May 23rd, 1964, the women won the right to vote. The men voted 169 yes to 99 no. I take affront a little bit to Seneca women given vote. Seneca Indian women are given right to vote. And I think it's important to point out that these women worked hard for it. They fought for it. Women such as Veronica Thompson, Helen Harris, Hildreth Kanjokity, Wilma Roberts, Martha Bucktooth, Miriam Lee. We also have the beautiful mothers and grandmothers from Cattaraugus that included Lorenza Pierce, Carolyn Pierce, Bernice Pierce, Vivian Sylvester, Hattie Halftown, and of course Martha Flamong. To them we say, Weso Nyawe.